Hey everyone, wherever you are right now and whenever you're watching this, I just want to say thank you for welcoming me into whatever space you find yourself in as you watch this, whether it's with your family in your living room or in the childhood bedroom you grew up in at your mom's house. I don't know where you are, but I'm so overjoyed that you're tuning in. I hope that you had a good Christmas, and I just want to let you know that this teaching is recorded with the intention of being watched on Sunday, December 26th, 2021. I'm making a point to say that because a lot of what we have been praying and thinking through as a teaching team has really centered around a question that I think lines up really well with December 26th. And that question is, now what? If you've been following along with us for the past 4 weeks, then you know that we have just walked through the Advent calendar for church teaching. We have celebrated the miraculous fact that Jesus Christ, Emmanuel, God with us, that he has come to redeem and rescue his people by taking on flesh. We celebrated that yesterday, the culmination of the hope of the people of Israel. They had seen a great light dawn on them, and God had answered their cries and their waiting by coming to be with them. And this is an amazing reality, and it is a beautiful truth, but for us, 2,000 years later, having celebrated this month of expectant waiting where it still kind of felt right because it wasn't Christmas yet, what do we do now? Or in other words, now what? Are we content with Advent being just the month of the year where we feel God's presence and we will ourselves to take our faith more seriously as we hope that the Holy Spirit will give us just a little bit of extra resolve to keep our resolutions this year? Is that what we're content with Advent being, just a check on the did we finish the year on a good note box or on a religious note box? See, the thing that I love so much, or one of the things I love so much about our church, is that I've talked with a number of you, and after talking and listening to what you've been saying, I think that question of now what is something that many of you are asking. I think many of you are wondering, how can we corporately and personally make the expectant posture of Advent the normal way that we live our lives? How can we be people who live like the author of the Hebrew letter to the church wrote and said when he said that we are people who fix our eyes on Jesus, who is the author and perfecter of our faith? And how can we be people who, while we wait, lay aside all of the sin that so easily entangles us, and we can be people who run the race of faith well? How do we continue to actively wait and prepare for Jesus to do what he has already done before as we wait for him to come again? I love that you're asking those questions. I am so encouraged by your desire to follow Jesus well. I just want to affirm that in you, that I see a deep desire to be people of love. I see a deep desire to not let Advent be simply that checked box that we talked about earlier. But how do we wait after the waiting? What does waiting look like for Christians this side of the resurrection of Jesus, knowing that one day all will be set right, but for right now, all we have is the presents we opened on Christmas and nothing that we're really tangibly waiting for like we were? I want to read Psalm 1 for you this morning. Not as a literal reading. I don't think that it's good to read Hebrew poetry literally. But I think that it's something that will guide us into a beautiful truth that the author wanted the reader to consider and to understand. So listen to this from Psalm 1. The truly happy person doesn't follow wicked advice. They don't stand on the road of sinners, and they don't sit with the disrespectful. Instead of doing those things, these people love the Lord's instruction, and they recite God's instruction day and night. They are like a tree planted by streams of water, which bears fruit at just the right time, and whose leaves never fade. Whatever they do succeeds. That is not true for the wicked. They are like dust that the wind blows away, and that's why the wicked will have no standing in the court of justice. Neither will sinners in the assembly of the righteous. The Lord is intimately acquainted with the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is destroyed. See, most translations of this passage, they say that the righteous people are the people who meditate on the law. For the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, meditation literature was a big part of their lifestyle. They would say things or recite things to themselves from the scriptures of the Torah over and over and over so that it became ingrained in them. And I want to be quick to note here that ultimately I think Jesus is the fulfillment that Psalm 1 talks about, that Jesus fulfills Psalm 1, and we can never truly be that perfectly like Jesus was. So I don't want you to hear me saying you need to meditate on the law 24/7, and if you ever stop, you're a sinner or anything like that, because that is not what I think is on offer. But it is important for me to note that I am saying what you think I'm probably saying. Or in other words, I think a huge part of waiting after the waiting is learning to meditate on the law and the ways of God as frequently as we possibly can. This is important, not to earn God's favor. It's not to be legalistic, but it is because that as we meditate on the law of the Lord, as was done by the ancient Near Eastern men and women who handed down our faith to us, as we do that which those who went before us did, we begin to become people who are holy. We begin to become people who walk in righteousness and who avoid the paths of the wicked. I think a 21st century understanding of these practices and what they did would be a lot like what Father Al taught us a couple weeks ago. That these things literally reform our neural pathways so that our brains automatically respond to situations in faithful trust and obedience to God's good vision of life. See, I think if we do this, then love, peace, hope, joy, all of these things, they are not necessarily things that we have to choose, but they are more so the people that we have become through the actions of meditating on the ways of the Lord and letting them shape us to God's good and beautiful vision for life. We don't have to choose compassion for the broken over judgment and ridicule anymore. We don't have to choose generosity over materialistic selfishness. We don't have to choose to honor our neighbor in love over ourselves, because those are simply the people that God has made us into. And I think that the way that we as a church have chosen to do this is a way that some of the earliest Christians practiced. Matt talked about it on December 12th, but it's something we're going to try. And that is the practice of meditating on and immersing ourselves in what are called the Psalms or the Songs of Ascent. These are 15 Psalms, Psalm 120 through Psalm 134, that were likely sung in succession by the Hebrew pilgrims who would make the trip to Jerusalem 3 times a year. If you want a fun little historical biblical fact, the 3 trips were for the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacle. And if you don't know anything about Hebrew or ancient Near Eastern geography or topography, then Jerusalem was likely the highest altitude place in Palestine. And for these Hebrews, they viewed that as extremely important because they believed that this was the closest thing to God's presence. See, they believed that God was transcendent or above or higher than their ways. So marching up the mountain to Jerusalem in their minds was figuratively and literally marching up towards the presence of God. Now, it's important to note that just because of their understanding of God's presence doesn't look like it does to us 2,000 years later, that makes any of this less true or less perfect in what it is seeking to accomplish for us as Christians 2,000 years later. I think what's important to remember is that for this group of people, this was about a pilgrimage towards where they were headed, and where they were headed was the holiness of God. And we too are headed towards the holiness of God as pilgrims through life. So they would sing these songs as they marched up the mountain to Jerusalem. And it was a beautiful thing as it literally formed their neural pathways into people of love and passion and hope and resolve in their lives. They would climb a mountain to remind themselves that as they await their ultimate destination, one they were traveling to right now in this very moment, that they would one day have communion with God in total holiness. And so these Psalms, they covered much of the Christian life and the Christian story. And these songs serve as what author Eugene Peterson called footprints. And I love that. He says that there's a big difference between footprints and monuments. Monuments are what you build when you say, look at how far we got. Footprints are a way of saying, this is where I was when God moved me to my next move. And so 3 times a year, every year, as they would march up the mountain to Jerusalem, they would say, remember this? This is where we sang this song and God reminded us of his faithfulness. This is where we were when God showed us our next move and he kept us going forwards. And so my prayer is that journeying through the Psalms of Ascent as a church following Advent will be a footprint for our church family. A way of saying this is where we were when we continued to press forward in faith into the life that Jesus himself lived and the life that he invites us into. A life where we are people who are marked by radical love for others, even our neighbors. A life that is marked by a steadfast commitment to holiness and righteousness because we do not belong to ourselves. Our stories are not our own to write and work out for ourselves, but rather they are a part of the great story that God has been writing throughout all of history. And so just like everyone who has come before us, I feel it is my job to tell you that this will not be easy. We are journeying on this endeavor together, and Jesus himself, having walked the terrain we are about to walk, and who promises to walk with us through it again, he's cared enough about us to tell us honestly that it's not going to be easy. This will not be absent of pain. It will not be absent of suffering or confusion or doubt and all kinds of things that honestly I would rather avoid. There's no quick fix, instant meal solution to the problem of the struggle and pain of life, especially as we live in the time between the times. We live in the road trip between where we were and where we are headed. And quite frankly, who gets excited for a road trip? Many of you have just road trip to get to where you're going for Christmas probably. And if you get excited for a road trip, then I don't know what to tell you. Like, we probably should talk at some point. You need to share some tips because I am a serial distraction artist for myself. Like, you will not believe the lengths to which I will go to prepare to make sure every Netflix show I want is downloaded, every podcast is downloaded, my video games are charged. Like, I am great at road trips, and yet it is the last thing I look forward to. See, when I think of road trips and the fact that we're headed somewhere, and that's kind of what following Jesus is like in this time, is following someone on a road trip, I think of the story of the Good Samaritan. I don't have proof of this, but I wonder if there was a reason that all 3 of the people who encountered the man beaten and nearly dying were in an in-between. That they were in their own road trip. It looked different than what we have with cars, but maybe there is some divine reason that in the story we see how 3 people handle a road trip interrupted. Each person who is interrupted by the inconvenience of a problem while they are in between where they are headed, I'm sure that this was in the listener's imagination. I'm sure that as they heard Jesus tell this parable, they saw someone going somewhere, not quite where they were headed yet, and so they were in between. And I wonder if they pictured them like I picture a Cirque du Soleil performer hanging in the air as they float between one ring or one bar that they're hanging from. The Cirque du Soleil performer, as they hang in midair, I'm fixated, I'm captivated because I don't know what's going to happen next. Anything can happen. It is like a space teeming with potential. I wonder if the people who heard Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan thought this as Jesus told them that a priest approached a man beaten and lying. See, anything could have happened here. He could have responded in compassion. He could have reached out and helped the man. Or he could have done, unfortunately, what he chose to and kept walking. And I don't know why he kept walking. I don't know if he was too interested in getting where he wanted to go. I don't know if he was afraid of harm, or if he was annoyed at being inconvenienced, or if it was national and ethnic prejudice, or whatever it was for the first man and the second man who were walking. But I do know that where they wanted to be kept them from going where God was leading them to act. And so, City Collective, will we, as the church established under the lordship and authority of Jesus, will we follow him through the long process of learning and living the ways of holiness? Will we journey with Jesus through the valleys, through the patchy terrain, through the rain, and through the good times, No matter how long it takes us to get where Jesus is leading, or how off course or off track it seems like he's leading us to, will we follow him through that and that long obedience? Or do we just want a Savior who is more like a spiritual tour guide, who shows us the highs of this life only and then drops us right back off where he started? I believe that we want to follow Jesus in what Eugene Peterson calls a long obedience in the same direction. And so as we learn to meditate on the law and the instructions of God together through the Psalms of Ascent, I just want to invite you to keep an open mind. I think that these are psalms and these are patterns and ways of life that will reform our neural pathways so that the people that we are headed towards becoming are the people that we actually are. And I think God can do something in that. So if you have communion this morning with you, and that's great. You're an overachiever, I guess. If you don't, that's okay. I want to go ahead and pray as we transition into your time of communion. Holy Father, God, I feel like it's like the night before, like a big adventure, that we are about to embark on a journey through Psalms written for your people, recited by your people, inspired by your Spirit. God, I pray that that even though we know that this journey will be tiresome, that it will be exhausting, that it will be painful and difficult, and that we will surely wrestle with you along the way about which way is the best or the fastest to go. God, help us to keep in mind that you don't get tired of us asking, are we there yet? God, that you are infinitely patient with us as we try to say that this way is actually a shortcut and we should go this way and avoid these things, or that doesn't look safe enough to travel through, so we should maybe turn back. But Jesus, you continue to invite us deeper and deeper. So I pray that as we wait after the waiting, that you would give us faith to continue to trust you, to keep following you, Jesus, even when it doesn't make sense. We love you. Bless our time of communion. Amen. Awesome. You're dismissed to your communion. That is all we have for this video for this week, but we will be back online next week, so we hope that you tune in and join us as we start our journey through the Psalms of Ascent. Thank you. Y'all have a blessed week.